All praise to the Creator and nobody else. Peace and love to everyone. So today, I'm going to do a couple lessons. I want you to pay attention to what I'm showing you and understand that the devil is tricky, and the way he got you, the ways he tricked you to serve him. Okay, so without further ado, we're going to run through a couple of videos.
You've likely heard the story of Lucifer, the fallen angel. According to Christian legend, Lucifer was the most senior and most beautiful angel in God's heavenly court. He wanted to be more powerful than God and rebelled along with some other corrupted angels. After an ensuing heavenly war, Lucifer and other angels were banished from heaven and descended all the way down to hell. Lucifer, now a fallen angel, became the devil. His fellow fallen angels became demons. Okay, with me so far? Good. The story you've just heard is not in the Bible. Well, at least not in the way it's often told. The real origin of Lucifer is a lot more interesting. It's actually one of misinformation, conflation, and one very curious mistranslation. Let me explain. Before we get into wars in heaven, fallen angels and hellfire, let's start with his name, Lucifer. It's just one of many names used for the devil, like Satan and the beast. And those names are used quite a lot of times in the Bible, but only once is the name Lucifer ever mentioned.
And all the names y'all been calling on now, because all names are the devil.
It's in the Old Testament's book of Isaiah. In chapter 14, verse 12 of the book, the prophet Isaiah says this: "How you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning. How you are cut down to the ground, you who weakened the nations." Even though the name Lucifer is mentioned, this taunting remark is actually directed towards the arrogant king of Babylon, whose kingdom had just been destroyed. Isaiah is basically teasing him for it. So, "How you fallen, O Lucifer, son of the morning," kind of just means, "King of Babylon, oh look how the mighty have fallen." But why did Isaiah need to call him Lucifer? What's Satan got to do with any of this? Well, you might say, Lucifer was ungraciously cast down from heaven as well. So, likening the king of Babylon to Lucifer is actually a pretty good comparison here. And yes, you would be right. But the thing is, if you examine the text in its original language, Isaiah was never really making this comparison in the first place. When we read the same text in its original language, Biblical Hebrew, Isaiah's taunt actually sounds a bit like this: "Ek nepauta mishamayim helel ben shachar, nigdatha la'aretz cha'olesh al-goyim." Did you hear me say the word Lucifer? No. Nowhere does the real Isaiah actually say this name. Instead of being called Lucifer, the king of Babylon is called Helel ben Shachar, literally a shining one, son of morning. In Hebrew, a shining one, son of morning, does not refer to Satan or the devil, but a planet, the planet Venus, otherwise known as the morning star. Besides the moon, Venus is the brightest body in the night sky, and because it's so bright, it's often the first star that can be seen in the evening.
These are also examples of how the devil not only got you to worship him, but got you to worship the planet or planets, which you're not supposed to do. The book tells you not to do that.
And the last star you can see when the sun comes up, hence the name, the morning star, or in Hebrew, shining one, son of morning, Helel ben Shachar. So back to Isaiah's taunt about the morning star, and it all begins to make sense if applied to the planet Venus. By describing the king of Babylon as, "O shining one, son of morning," Isaiah is likening the king's epic fall from grace to the movement of the morning star, which every morning appears to fall from the sky into the underworld. In the Sumerian religions of ancient Iraq, the goddess Inanna was associated with the planet Venus. There are several hymns of praise to Inanna in her role as the goddess of the planet, but a particularly famous hymn, Inanna's Descent to the Underworld, describes how, unlike any other deity, Inanna is able to fall from heaven, descend into the netherworld, and rise back the next day, just like the planet Venus does every dusk and dawn. We've established that Isaiah is actually talking about the movements of the morning star, the planet Venus. But how on earth did it become Lucifer? Well, once the Bible was translated to Latin by early Christians, they came across Isaiah 14:12 and translated the Hebrew word for morning star into their own word for morning star, Lucifer. Lucifer is a Latin word for morning star, with the word literally translating to light bringer. In Greco-Roman myth, the morning star was often personified and considered a god, and in some myths, considered to be the son of Aurora, the dawn. How did the morning star, Lucifer, aka Venus, turn so evil, and where do the fallen angels come in? To thank for that, you have the Book of Enoch. It's an apocryphal biblical text written around 300 to 200 BCE, and it didn't quite make it into the final cut of the Bible, but was incredibly popular in Second Temple Judaism. In the Book of Enoch, there's a chapter called the Book of Watchers. And in this chapter, we have the Watchers, who were dispatched to Earth to watch over humanity. But they did a terrible, terrible job, and they soon began to lust for human women, and, led by their leader Samyaza, all started to defect from God's command, and began to procreate among human women. The offspring are called the Nephilim, or giants, who pillaged the earth and endangered humanity. Samyaza and his fallen angel cronies also began to teach the humans certain forbidden arts, like weaponry, cosmetics, mirrors, sorcery, and other hidden secrets. Meanwhile, God's looking down in anger and disbelief, so allows a great flood to rid the earth of the corrupted humankind and those Nephilim, but first warning Noah to build his ark, as described in the book of Genesis. Afterwards, he gets his loyal angels to punish the fallen Watchers, including their evil leader, Samyaza. Remember, none of this is actually canon for mainstream Christianity or Judaism. It's labelled as an apocryphal book. In today's terms, that's the equivalent of being a sort of Bible fan fiction. But at the time, people loved the Book of Enoch so much that it began to influence contemporary religious ideas. Even in the New Testament Book of Jude, the Book of Enoch is directly quoted. Around the time of Enoch's circulation, Jews and early Christians rummaged through the Old Testament to see if they'd missed any hidden secrets, and they just so happened to stumble on a little verse in the book of Isaiah. Instead of seeing it as a reference to the planet Venus, as originally intended, they found a hidden reference to that fallen angel Samyaza, as seen in the book of Enoch. And when early Christians read Isaiah in Latin, they came to understand Lucifer not as Lightbringer, but as a name for a fallen angel. And so, Lucifer, the name for the fallen angel, finally stuck, and was added to a growing number of names used for the devil, such as Satan, the Beast, Beelzebub, and so on.
And Morning Star, and how funny is Mr. J, there's a devil, name is Morning Star.
Now each one of those names have their own fascinating origins that I'd love to cover in a future video, but for now, I'll leave it at that. To remind us that death will come to all, and wielding a scythe to harvest unfortunate souls, he reaps what has been sown, hence the name, the Grim Reaper. Nowadays, the Grim Reaper has become a pop culture icon, recognised across the world of books, comics, TV shows, movies and games as a quintessential symbol of death. And whilst we're so familiar with who the Grim Reaper is and what he does, we are less certain about his origins. Where does the Grim Reaper come from? The answer may surprise you. So, many world myths and cultures have some sort of personification of death, especially in the form of a god or goddess. The Greeks had Thanatos, literally translating to death. He's sometimes depicted as a beautiful winged man, occasionally cloaked in black and carrying a sword, but in later depictions, Thanatos appears as a little winged boy, similar to Cupid, this time who carries an upside-down torch, eerily representing a life extinguished. The Aztecs have Mictlantecuhtli, the queen of the realm of the dead, who rules the afterlife with Mictlantecuhtli, her husband. Hindu and Buddhist mythologies have King Yama, who rides atop a buffalo holding a lasso to drag souls into the afterlife. As Buddhism spread to the Far East, so too did he. In China, King Yama turned into King Yang, and in Japan as King Enma. But another common symbol for death, other than a god, is a spectral figure who escorts the living into the world of the dead. Look at these ancient North American cave paintings. They feature these otherworldly beings who are believed to represent spirits that accompany souls into the afterlife. And you may have heard of Charon in Greek myth, a hooded figure who ferries the recently deceased over the river Styx in their passage to the underworld.
Oh, don't forget, those are the same demons that came through the portal. That's why they drew them on that wall like that, the cave, and made people go crazy and ate the people and stuff like that. Remember, I showed you that video, that was a while back.
For a few, of course. And in Korean myth, there is the netherworld emissary, the Joseon Saja. He's depicted as a strict bureaucrat, attempting to meet his busy quota of souls for the day. Now Now these personifications of death are along the right lines with the Grim Reaper, a figure that appears at the moment of death to take you away with him. So where does he come from? Well, it's not really the Bible, at least not as a cloaked skeleton wielding a scythe. The Angel of Death, sometimes known as Azrael, is often seen as the strongest candidate. But the Bible doesn't really offer any physical description of the angel. No skulls and sides in sight. And the Angel of Death's job is to kill people. The Grim Reaper doesn't really do the killing here. Perhaps the Grim Reaper is one of the 4 horsemen of the Apocalypse mentioned in the Book of Revelations. After all, Death, the final horseman of the Apocalypse, is the only one that's actually named. But again, there's no physical description offered for a Grim Reaper. In Greek, the language of the original script, the horseman is actually named Thanatos, death, the same name for the deity of death in the myths of ancient Greece, and arguably a closer inspiration for this biblical character. So instead of the Bible, there may be good reason to believe that the Grim Reaper comes from a series of folklores across Europe. In the Netherlands, there exists the Merger Hein, also known as the Beënderman, Bone Man. Similar to the Grim Reaper in looks, the Merger Hein is a skeletal figure who appears at times of death and pestilence. Perhaps the closest parallel comes from Celtic folklore, in a being known as the Ankou. An Ankou appears as a man or a skeleton, and it wears a cloak and often wields a scythe, and in some stories it's described as a shadow, often atop of a cart collecting the dead. He's even said to wear a black robe, with a large hat which conceals his face. He's one of Death's henchmen, and his job ranges from protecting graveyards to collecting souls on Death's behalf. And according to a later Christian legend, the Ankou is the first child of Adam and Eve. From these figures, the modern Grim Reaper first emerged. It coincided with, and was likely caused, by a key event in the mid-14th century. Around 1346, a mysterious disease had arrived to Europe from Asia, and people were becoming infected by the millions. Now known as the Black Death, it became one of the worst pandemics that has ever existed. To your average medieval peasant, it would seem that the end times were close. The foul stench of rotting flesh was everywhere. Dead bodies lying in the streets were loaded into carts and dumped into plague pits. During these peak years of 1346 to 1353, the total number of deaths in Europe could be anywhere between 45 to 60%, more than half of Europe dead within a few years. And it wasn't just Europe. The Black Death may have reduced the global population from an estimated 475 million to 350 million, just over a quarter of Earth's human population. Death was everywhere, and the motif of skeletons, disease and mortality became extremely prevalent in art and literature. An idea known as the Dance of Death, or Danse Macabre, quickly emerged. Death became a personified and ever-present figure who does not discriminate between good or bad, rich or poor, holy or unholy. Kings and peasants were the same, and were just as likely joined in Death's gruesome dance. All this likely combined with those pre-existing figures of folklore, such as the Merger Hein or the Ankou, and all were homogenized into one single skeletal figure, the Grim Reaper. And since then, the Grim Reaper made its way into the hearts, minds, and nightmares of everyday folk. So real or not is ultimately up to you. But in the case of the Grim Reaper, let's hope to never find that one ourselves. Hey, thanks for watching. On YouTube, you may have stumbled across the occasional nursery rhyme channel. They promise light-hearted songs and innocent fun, perfect for small children and their exhausted parents. These channels have amassed a huge number of views. This one in particular has over 100 million subscribers and is set to become the largest on the site. But lurking behind these playful songs lie dark and disturbing backstories, rhymes believed to be about the plague, slavery, and in one instance, burying someone alive. But do they have any historical truth behind them, or are they simply urban legends meant to frighten and entertain? Let's take a look at the gruesome and grim origins behind our beloved children's songs, and separate the fact from the folklore as we delve into the dark side of nursery rhymes. We start with a familiar one, a classic childhood staple.
Black sheep, have you any wool? Yes sir, 3 packs full. One for the master, one for the day, one for the little boy who lives down the lane.
At face value, this is a song about sheep and wool, right? Well, the controversy surrounding this nursery rhyme began in the late 80s and 90s when it was connected to slavery in the American South. Proponents of this view argue the following. The black sheep is a reference to the African descent of American slaves. The 3 bags full of wool reflects the cotton that slaves were forced to collect in large bags, and the master-sheep relationship is reminiscent of master-slave language. This perceived connection has led schools to change the song's title to Bar Bar Rainbow Sheep, to disassociate it from slavery. However, many experts believe that the song actually has nothing to do with slavery, nor even America. Instead, the song is believed to have originated in Britain. The first written record of this song is from an English nursery rhyme book called Tom Thumb's Pretty Songbook. It was written in 1744 and is the oldest surviving collection of English nursery rhymes out there. It's older than the Declaration of Independence, and so technically predates America itself. That said, slavery was still widespread whilst America was a British colony. Nowadays, people believe the song came from the Middle Ages, originating with a medieval tax on the wool trade. Known as the Great Wool Tax, it was set up by Edward I, who needed extra money to pay for the Crusades, a series of brutal conflicts in the Holy Land. Under these new laws, English wool was heavily taxed. A third of a bag's price went to the king, another went to the church, and a final third went to the farmer. Thus, one for the master, being the king, one for the dame is the church, the so-called bride of Christ, and one for the little boy who lives down the lane, the farmers. So instead of being a rhyme about the slave trade, Bar Bar Black Sheep is a medieval song about the money made from the heavy taxation of wool that was used later to fund the mass murder and slaughter of the Crusades. Perhaps a stretch, but nonetheless dark. Okay, moving on. This nursery rhyme is also attested in the songbook from 1744. You'll be familiar with the lyrics. They go as follows.
London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down. London Bridge is falling down, my fair lady.
Now this nursery rhyme has a handful of dark origins, but which one of them is the most plausible? An early explanation for the song came from Samuel Lang in 1844. He believed that the song describes a Viking raid, specifically Olaf II of Norway, who allegedly pillaged the town of London in 1014. The Norse saga Heimskringla has this strange verse. London Bridge is broken down, gold is won and bright renown. Shields resounding, war horns sounding, Hild is shouting in the din. Arrows singing, mailcoats ringing, Odin makes our Olaf win. Lang believes that this skaldic verse was the basis of our nursery rhyme today, but from the perspective of the poor Londoners left to rebuild it. Experts argue that this translation of the Old Norse has been made to fit around the nursery rhyme, and thus takes a lot of liberties in the translation. So, whilst London Bridge was likely raided by the Vikings at some point in history, it was unlikely to have been the basis for this nursery rhyme. This next theory is far darker. Some speculate that the song is all about London Bridge and how people were buried alive within its foundations. So, back in the day, there was this punishment known as immurement, a grisly practice where people, sometimes even children, were buried alive within walls. The folklorist Alice Bertha Gone believed that this story was within the nursery rhyme itself. She homed in on the line, "Take the keys and lock her up," somewhere later in the poem, and took it as a possible link to the immurement practice. But unfortunately for her, no skeletons of adults, nor children, have ever been unearthed in the foundations of London Bridge, so we can discount this theory for now. Okay, this third theory is the most likely candidate. It goes back to the idea that the bridge was destroyed a handful of times, but just not by the Vikings. Records show that in 1209, King John ordered London Bridge be built. Now it may have existed before then, perhaps stretching all the way back to Roman occupation. This new medieval bridge was made from stone, but with that brought its own challenges. Over time, shopkeepers and residents began to construct buildings on top of the stone foundations, and the bridge soon became very cramped, and in such close quarters, fires spread fast. A few years later in 1212, the first fire broke out on both ends, with many bridge dwellers trapped in the centre. Years later it was rebuilt, only to be destroyed again in two separate uprisings, one in 1381 and one in 1450. In both cases, the bridge was rebuilt, but, as you may have guessed, it burnt down again in 1633. At this point, it was left partially unbuilt, just in time for the Great Fire of London in 1666. No surprise why the song "London Bridge is Falling Down" came about shortly after. The bridge was in a constant state of disrepair, owing largely to those houses built upon it. It's an amusing commentary on this seemingly cursed structure. No Viking raids or burying alive this time. Another famous nursery rhyme, but also famously dark.
Ring your roses, a pocket full of posies, a tissue, we all fall down.
Many folklorists have connected it to the Great Plague, but how? Those last two lines, where children sneeze and fall down, are seen as a veiled reference to those dying from the plague. The plague in question being the Great Plague of London in 1666. The same year, if you recall, as the Great Fire of London. Bad year. It was an outbreak of bubonic plague, an epidemic that killed an estimated 100,000 people. The death toll of the Great Plague is dwarfed by the Black Death a few centuries prior. It's believed that the Black Death outbreak of 1346 to 1353 killed an estimated 75 million to 200 million people. It was the most lethal pandemic of all time, and led to the development of the Grim Reaper. But that's the topic of another video. Back to Ring of Roses. According to legend, children began to dance and sing around the corpses of the infected dead, and mockingly sing this song. An incredibly disturbing and gruesome legend, were it to be true. It isn't. It's only until the mid-20th century, until folklorists start coming up with this plague story about Ring of Roses. Before then, no such legend existed. The song only appears in English songbooks in 1881, so if the song did originate in the 17th century, or even in the Middle Ages as some speculate, one would expect to see it written down much earlier. Now, if we wish to get scientific and go further, then the symptoms of the plague don't even match up with the nursery rhyme. The bacterium responsible for the bubonic plague, Yersinia pestis, was transferred via rats, not sneezing as in the song. Instead, the main symptoms of the plague were these large, uncomfortable warts called buboes, hence the name bubonic plague. The infected would also experience nausea, vomiting, and fever, but sneezing is not one of them. So if it didn't originate with the plague, where is it from? Well, it's still a mystery. In fact, many believe that the song didn't even originate in England, but may have come from Europe or America. The thing is, with so many variations of this nursery rhyme, it becomes harder and harder to locate its true origin. Some of the oldest versions come from America, so the song may have originated there. This version from Texas, for example, in 1939, has no perceivable connection to death at all. I say all this, but even if the song isn't about the plague, it somehow still feels creepy. The same is true for all the nursery rhymes discussed in the video, and it begs the question, why are nursery rhymes so inherently dark? One of the most frightening things is when something safe or childlike is revealed as evil and dark. The trope has a name, subverted innocence. We see it all the time in horror movies. The demonic orphan in The Omen, the possessed toy Chucky in Child's Play, and the child-eating clown Pennywise from It. Nursery rhymes are another example of subverted innocence. They are warped into having frightening and disturbing origins. Some indeed do, but many don't.